The idea tonight is that we're all crazy, but the concept of illness is probably a historical mistake. In my opinion, the argument that some of our more distressing emotions, thoughts, behaviours are best thought of as symptoms of an illness, which can then be understood, the etiology determined, and treatments prescribed, is a metaphor, a way of thinking which is profoundly flawed and has led to a number of unfortunate consequences. I think that the way in which we think about, as well as act towards our own mental health, the circumstances in our lives that give rise to distress, has implications for how we design services, how we commission services, and ultimately how we interact with each other. It's my argument that we need change, and we need radical change, and we need change not only in how we deliver services, but in the very way in which we think about the whole concept of mental health. I get the impression that my views are seen as both controversial, but they're also bizarrely reflected in nearly everything that people say. This is a quote from a few years ago, from a rather influential report, much liked by politicians and government ministers, called the Schizophrenia Commission. And one of the points to take from this slide is, if you don't want people to quote the things that you say, then don't say them in the first place. And this is a quote from the chair of the Commission, former, I believe, President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, Professor of Psychological Medicine at the Institute of Psychiatry down in London. The message that comes through loud and clear is that people are being badly let down by the system in every area of their lives. I profoundly believe that we should invest in our nation's mental health, including doubling or even tripling the amount of money that we spend on mental health. But somebody once said that it's a sign of stupidity if we keep on doing the same thing and expect different results each time. While I think we should invest properly in our mental health, we need to change the way in which we conceptualize the problem and have a rethink of the way in which we do things. We can't carry on because the system that we have at the moment is simply not delivering the results that we want. Quite a number of influential commentators in the field of medicine have commented on how outcomes for you and me in terms of mental health have simply failed to keep pace with the profoundly positive innovations that have happened in physical medicine. It's the case now that the most common cause of death in young people is suicide. The most common cause of death in women in the first year after giving birth is, again, suicide. The reason for that is twofold. First of all, that as a society, the rise in technological medicine has been wonderful for infectious diseases, and including for the technical business of giving birth. My daughter is highly unlikely to die during childbirth and is highly unlikely to develop puerperal sepsis. And if she does, it will be rapidly treated. When it comes to our mental health, the outcomes are actually getting worse. Antidepressant prescription, the use of Ritalin for kids who have attention problems at school or in other ways fail to fit in with the milieu of education, anxiety drugs, antipsychotic drugs, are all going up. The number of prescriptions have apparently doubled in the past decade. And around 1 in 10 of us, maybe as many as 1 in 6 American school children are now taking powerful psychiatric drugs. It's also the case that people rarely, even within the profession of psychiatry, agree that the situation is perfect. Some of you might remember Anthony Clare, a famous psychiatrist, did in the psychiatrist's chair and other talks for the BBC, Radio 4 and so forth. He wrote a book about 30 years ago now called Psychiatry in Dissent, how within the profession of psychiatry there's a dispute as to where we should go. And I don't intend you to read these, but these are two effectively editorials in the British Journal of Psychiatry, separated by 4 years, each of them written by a group of about 30 professors of psychiatry. Before I go any further, I should say that I profoundly disagree with one of them, and I profoundly agree with the other. But that's not really my point. My point is that the fact that I can agree with one editorial and disagree with the other tells you something about the nature of these schisms within our mental health care. And that speaks to the idea that although I, as a psychologist, have a particular point of view, this isn't a guild dispute between one profession and another. It's more splits and divisions, a little bit like the Conservative Party, within the organisation itself. What you have is a wake-up call for British psychiatry. The authors arguing that patients are being let down and the profession of psychiatry itself is at risk if we do not, in their view, grasp the idea that psychiatry should be seen as a branch of medicine. That people have a right to have their disorders, their diseases, their illnesses diagnosed by competent physicians. There should be proper investigation into the biological causes of those sources of distress, and treatment should follow that are as expert and effective as the treatment for infection or for cancer and so forth. And about 4 years later, another group of influential, about 30 professors of psychiatry said kind of exactly the same thing and kind of something different, where they said, again, patients are dying unnecessarily, we're letting people down in all walks of life, and the profession of psychiatry is going in profoundly the wrong direction. But they took the opposite view, that instead of seeing psychiatry as a branch of biomedicine, people needed to understand why we all become depressed and anxious and traumatized following the experiences that we've had in life. And instead of seeing this as a game in which we diagnose and then treat diseases of the brain, this is an issue where we as healers, as clinicians, as tutors or guides or educators, reach out to our fellow human being and try to understand the pain that they're in and help them find a way through those difficulties. Two very profoundly different visions for the future of psychiatry. Like I say, I profoundly agree with one and I profoundly disagree with the other. But this isn't a dispute between one profession that has a vision of the future and other people have a professional gripe with them. These are schisms running through British mental health care. As well as me agreeing with one side and not agreeing with the other, I think I should at this point raise the issue of a guy called Denias Puras, who's employed by the United Nations to write about our rights to the enjoyment of the fullest possible health, both physical and mental health. He happens to be a child psychiatrist from Vilnius in Lithuania, and the middle of last year published a rather interesting report which made recommendations, especially for developing countries, about how they should develop their mental health care system. And this is, I think, a fair and absolutely accurate quote from his report, where he points out that what we should do, and his advice to emerging countries, is that we should abandon the predominant medical model that seeks to cure individuals by targeting disorders. And it's quite good when you plead in aid the United Nations. Why do we need to do it? Why do we need this profound change? Well, this is a photo that I took in a place called Bathurst, just on the edge of the outback in Australia. And compared to British mental health hospitals, it's actually quite beautiful. I mean, just as a test, for those of you who know anything about mental health care in the UK, all of the light bulbs are working. This is quite remarkable. And it's really quite nice. I sent this to a colleague and said, guess where I am? And she replied, you're on a surgical ward. And then she immediately said, no, you can't be on a surgical ward because there wouldn't be a glass panel separating you from the patients if you're on the surgical ward. So we know where we are. My point about this is really quite nice. This is high quality care, but it unequivocally tells people that they're in a hospital. There is absolutely no doubt that this is a healthcare situation and that if you develop problems, feel that life is no longer worth living, lose touch with reality, become so distressed that you can't cope, and people take you here, you're unequivocally told that you're ill and that you have an illness that needs treatment. This is very different from being checked into a clinic or attending maybe a monastery or some place of safety and seclusion. It's nice, but it's medical. And when we look at the newspapers, we see something interesting. I think the earlier talk was interesting in terms of these broad clouds of probable, possible genetic risks that apply to wide and broad categories of human experience, in each case interacting with the environment. And yet it's not reported that way. It's reported as schizophrenia revealed to be 8 genetically distinct disorders. And that in itself, if there are any students of English here, that's a really weird sentence, because it's saying that a single illness is 8 distinct illnesses. It doesn't make any sense. When you look at some of the other headlines, crowdsourced genetic data shows depression is a brain disease. Well, maybe it's a rather interesting brain disease that tends to follow pretty reliably when bad things happen to people. And it's just interesting to think, I would use the word obsession, but that could be a quite insulting idea, that what happens is we simply know that negative experiences in life lead to a whole range of mental health outcomes. And yet we are, I can't think of a word other than obsessed, with looking within the biology of the brain and the genetics of the human being in order to try to find out areas of vulnerability between us. And it's a little bit like if we're here in Liverpool and we point out to the council that there are massive potholes on the pavement and hundreds of people are falling over. Every day, 100 people fall over. And of the 100 people that fall over, maybe 1 in 10 of them breaks a limb. And Joe Anderson replies, but what's really interesting is let's look at the osteoporosis in the UK and see whether we can predict, out of those 100 people who fall over because of the potholes, the 10 of them that break a bone. That's where we really need to be focusing our research. Rubbish. We need to fill in the potholes. And if it's the case that some of us are more vulnerable to the stresses of life, if that's what our genetics reveal, and you have to be, I was going to swear, but you have to be very clever and use very powerful statistics to detect that. Let's fill in the potholes before we start working out who's genetically vulnerable to breaking a limb when they fall over, please. It's not just me saying it. Again, I plead in aid some of the people that possibly would disagree with some of the conclusions of this. This is a tweet sent out recently by the Royal College of Psychiatrists talking about how the financial crash of 2008, 2010, so people that I employed to buy and sell my house and invest my pension for me, invested in dodgy Trumpian deals, and then it all went horribly wrong, and then the government did the wrong thing by bailing out the rich people and stuffing the poor. We know this. What does the Royal College of Psychiatrists say about it? Well, if you look very carefully, they say that the selling of subprime mortgages caused a rise in suicide. This is not, it's really bizarre, because something environmental happened, and then later there's some genetic vulnerability. This is the Royal College of Psychiatrists saying that bastards playing fast and loose with our money caused the deaths of people who then subsequently lost their jobs in the financial crash. I think that's true. I think they did cause it. Not so worried about their genetics. I'm more worried about the bankers. And all of this focus on what happens inside our skulls, I think, has various pernicious consequences. I think it means that we take very powerful drugs that have a very powerful impact on our bodies, including reducing the life expectancy by up to 20 years for people who take long-term psychiatric medication. And it takes our mind away from the things that we really need to be focusing on. This is a real photo of homeless people in the city of Mumbai, and our glorious leader sitting over them. When these ogres in human form make the decisions that they do, then people suffer as a result. Some of us might suffer more than others. Some of us might suffer more than others because of the experiences that we've had in our childhood. Some of us might suffer more than others because of the people that we have around us in order to protect us from those stresses. And some of us might suffer more than others because we're born with interesting genes. Interestingly, those interesting genes possibly make us more creative, make us more sensitive, make us better lovers, but also make us more sensitive to the stresses and strains of everyday life. And I, for one, don't particularly want to change my genes. I want him to be out of the White House. So if that's the analysis, if that's our understanding of what the situation looks like, what do we do about it? I've written about it, of course, and this is where one does one's plug for one's book, and also it's a very nice cover, and it's very pretty. So what do I say? Well, I argue that we should see mental health problems as fundamentally social and psychological issues. Interestingly, if any of you are fans of the biomedical model, I think the idea that I think and feel because of the actions of my brain is absolutely true. And when I get depressed, or when I get anxious, when I hear voices, when I become paranoid, when I make mistakes in the relationships I have with other people, of course, it's the biology of my brain that's driving that. But that's also true when I put together these PowerPoint slides, when I decide to wear this, when I fall in love, and when I get angry at my kids for being incompetent. Those are all driven by the function of my brain. And if I were to publish my poetry, which I shouldn't do because I'm a shit poet, then I think that's because of the way in which my brain works, just as much as when I get depressed. I think it's interesting, but I don't think it's anywhere near being a disease. Having said that, maybe writing poetry would be a sign of it. Anyway, I'm off the subject. What that means, I think, is instead of looking for disorders, looking for illnesses, looking for symptoms, looking for etiology, and looking for treatment, instead of looking to see why we have developed a depressive disorder, we should understand what makes people feel hopeless, what makes people feel suicidal, what makes people feel despairing, what gives us hope, what makes us feel loved, what makes us feel secure. Instead of looking for the causes of something that we want to define a social anxiety disorder, we should understand why we feel confident in social situations and what drives and what affects the confidence that we have when in the presence of others. Identifying phenomena, understanding them, and then responding humanely to the experiences is, I think, perfectly legitimate. Diagnosing illnesses and then treating them, I think, takes us away from the subject matter. And instead, for me as a psychologist, we need to understand why we've learned to make sense of the world in which we have. Part of that learning will be in terms of how the variance between us affect, in terms of our biology, affects the way we make sense of the world. But for me, if I was to take the 80 or 100 people who are in this room and think about lining us up in terms of the relative risks we have of developing mental health problems, it's my profound belief that variance between us in terms of the way that our biology of our brains functions, or more importantly, because the biology of our brain is affected by the things that happen to us during our life, variance between us in terms of the fundamental genetics of our neurological makeup, that variance between us probably explains a trivial amount of the variance between us in terms of our mental health. And yet I think the things that happen to us explain a huge amount. I'm standing here as a white, male, middle-class, heterosexual man. Half of the audience are female. The experience of women and the experience of men in this country is profoundly different, not because our biology works differently. The sodium ions work the same way for men and women, but because the experience of growing up in a gendered and sexist society has a profound impact on the way that women, girls develop. Some of us come from non-dominant cultures, some of us have darker skin than others, and again, that experience growing up is a profound importance in the way that we look at the world. I think differences in biology are trivial compared to those sorts of experiences. And again, just to think about the gene-environment interaction, you know, the difference in skin colour between people is probably getting better until Brexit and Trump came along, and then there's an interaction between politics and variance. I think the biology explains very little. I think sociology and psychology explain a very great deal. And that means that we have to change the way that we think about emotions, about the way that we think about mental health. This is just, for me, this is the way that I make sense of it, in that, of course, biological factors, the way that my brain processes information is probably in part affected by my genes, and I'll thank my father and my mother for those genes, but it's also affected by the things that happen to me. I think that the differences between us in the way that we are brought up, the way that we're parented, the way that we're exposed to stresses during our formative years plays more of a role in terms of the way that we develop our emotions and our mental health than differences between us in terms of biology. So, social factors and circumstantial factors impacting on our... What do people think about it? Well, drop the language of disorder. I believe in the experience of post-traumatic stress, although just call it trauma. When bad things happen, you feel bad. I don't think that's an illness. I don't think veterans coming back from war traumatized by what they've seen and what they've done constitutes a disorder. I think it's being human. Social anxiety is a phenomenon. I'm standing up here giving a talk. Of course there is such a phenomenon as social anxiety. I don't care whether it's social anxiety disorder or social anxiety. Depression is a phenomenon. Major depressive disorder is a marketing scam by the pharmaceutical industries and people with professional interests to bear. We all get anxious, we all get depressed. Some of us get depressed so profoundly and for such prolonged periods that we need professional help. I think that that's perfectly true, but that doesn't constitute the definition of an illness. So we should drop the language of disorder. I'm not the only person who agrees. Again, I'm pleading in aid people more powerful and richer than myself. I resent the fact that the British Medical Journal put a question mark after the statement about too many disorders. This is about the new psychiatric manual. We're proliferating labels to attach to children. We're proliferating labels that are attached to each other, and then we market pharmaceutical products to address those manufactured ideas. Instead, well, PhD students working with me, Kate Alsop and I, proposed that we use what's already there, which is the things that happen to us. Instead of diagnosing people with depression, we could, for instance, use a code already in the World Health Organization's lexicon of medical terms, homelessness. What's very interesting about this as a medical diagnosis is not, of course, a diagnosis, isn't the identification of a thing that you should respond to. It's here. So the World Health Organization recognizes that for us as health professionals, we could reach out to people who are homeless and offer them the help that they need. and that that's a reasonable thing for us to get reimbursed about. When people say that you need a diagnosis in order to get services, not according to the World Health Organization, you don't. So we should identify the things that have happened to us, we should note those down on the forms, and we should intervene in order to help people. How? Well, this is a colleague of mine, Emma Williamson, working in a homeless hostel in London. So instead of being a clinical psychologist offering treatment for people's disorders referred to her from the service into the NHS, she goes and works in the homeless hostel. So she's part of the staff working with people in their daily lives. This is, okay, it's a statutory agency, it's not quite the guy's living room, but that's where he was currently resident. This is a homeless shelter that has a psychologist working to help people deal with whatever difficulties they have at the time. It does involve addressing their mental health needs, but it also means working with them in their lived experience. It also means thinking about some of the things that we can do, not to treat mental health problems, but to intervene in order to improve our well-being. So these are what's called 5 ways to well-being, very simple. Keep physically active, keep mentally active. You should all sign up to do yet another degree, it's very good for you. You should give. People who give their time and their efforts, not their money, to charity, feel better about themselves, connect with other people. Loneliness kills you, and there are things that you can do in order to connect with other people. And finally, this idea of mindfulness and staying open-minded is a very positive way. And we should think about this as an experience whereby we as a community respond to people in distress, rather than establishing a technological system of hospitals or clinics that treat people who are ill. This is just up the road in Bootle, where there's the Kindfulness Cafe. So some cafes are, an American-style diner. If you remember Pulp Fiction, Uma Thurman and John Travolta go to a movie star-themed bar, right? So it's a bar, it serves you food and it serves you drink, and it's themed with movie stars in it. Well, this is a cafe that's themed around mental health. That's its raison d'etre. It sells you coffee, sells you cake, but it's a cafe that deals with emotional issues. So this is combining community action and a focus on our mental health. And this is where people would go for support and for advice, to meet with professionals perhaps, but also just to connect with each other and support each other. And we should get out there and address the root causes of people's misery and distress. I like this photo because I didn't get up to talk, but after Rachel Maskell, who's the MP for York, there was Len McCluskey, trade union leader, and then there was me, and I quite like that. It's what we should be doing. So as well as doing our service as mental health professionals treating supposed illnesses, we should get out there and argue for the sorts of society and the sort of living conditions that would take away some of the environmental stresses. We should protect children from childhood abuse. We should equip parents with the skills necessary in order to protect their children from abuse. We should also protect children from bullying. We should also reform our education system. So instead of labelling kids with ADHD, if they fail to fit into an education system, which rather bizarrely take kids who can't wake up until 11 o'clock in the morning. Seriously, they can't wake up until 11 o'clock in the morning, and we make them go to school from 8:30 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. It's a bizarre system, and if you can't fit in with that educational system, you're labelled as having ADHD and giving Ritalin. We should change the system. So I stand with the politicians as much as I stand with the doctors. And finally, we were thinking about ways to wrap all of this up in simple messages, and we were thinking of the Stonewall campaign that put on literally on the side of a bus, "Some of us are gay, get over it." And we were thinking of the National Secular Society that had a sign on the side of a bus, "There probably is no God, get out there and enjoy your life." And this is the words of, we don't really know whether it's the words of Jackie Dillon, who's an activist in the area of mental health, or Eleanor Longden, because they kind of both came up with the message themselves. And it probably doesn't matter, because rather wonderfully, this was a phrase used about 2 weeks ago by Oprah Winfrey on American TV. And this is exactly what we should do. Instead of trying to work out what's wrong with people, we should ask people what's happened to them. And on that note, I shall stop. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Now I've just got time for a couple of questions. Is there a question, Peter? to start then, obviously you have a lot of content in your session. If you had to pick one thing to change, what would it be?
I was sat next, I made an off-colour joke about Marxism about a week ago over dinner, and it turned out the person I was sitting next to was one of the richest men in America, and it kind of, the dinner went quite well. I was pointing out how I admired Bill Gates because he's focusing on things like malaria and diarrhea. If I had huge amounts of money, then I would probably do two things. I would improve our education system, and I would teach young people how to be parents before they even thought about having children. So I'd invest in parenting and civics lessons for young people so that they would grow up able to be better parents. Start right from the beginning, I would say.
Okay, does anyone else have a question? Oh, in the back.
Hi, so you said we should stop thinking of things in terms of disorders. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit. Do you mean the general public, researchers, people and clinicians, just everyone?
Yeah,
or?
so I think all of them. I mean, I think for the general public, I think we should be thinking about experiences. So the experiences of losing touch with reality, not the disorder of schizophrenia, but the experience of losing touch with reality, the phenomena of hearing voices, of becoming paranoid, of being unable to communicate your thoughts to other people, just being terrified in the middle of the night, and talk about those experiences. For clinicians, I think the same thing. So I think we've put an awful lot of effort into trying to working out what the etiology of major depressive disorder is, and we haven't put nearly as enough effort into understanding why people feel hopeless, and then what to do about it. I mean, quite a lot of our mental health care is rather surprisingly not quite as humane when you meet it in the flesh as you would expect it to be. So, trying to understand and then respond to people who are desperately unhappy and are feeling on the edge of giving up on life, and responding to that rather than trying to treat their illnesses. Of course, from the perspective I come from, not treating their illnesses with drugs, but not even using techniques like cognitive behavior therapy, because the problem there is still that you're assuming that somebody's got a problem and then trying to treat it. And I think we should shift that emphasis onto engaging with the person and trying to work out how we could help them either rebuild or build the sort of life that they're entitled to, and to think in a different perspective, as Denias Puris said. And then finally, I think from the point of view of research, I mean, the diagnostic categories that we use are incredibly invalid, stunningly unreliable, are the product of today's particular outlook on life. We don't use... In 1973, there was a vote of the American Psychiatric Association, and rather wonderfully, given Brexit, the vote was 52% in favour and 48% against, and the vote was whether homosexuality was still a mental illness or not. So that means that at that time, 48% of the American Psychiatric Association's voting members thought homosexuality was an illness. These things change as the mores change and our thoughts change and what we think of an illness being change. And I think we should stop that. I'm not in favour of treating people for anything, really, let alone, of course, God forbid, homosexuality. But I think it's interesting to understand it. I think we should understand how and why traumatic events traumatise us. I think we need to understand, as well as preventing the consequences of childhood bullying, we need to understand in what ways childhood bullying affects the development of the self-esteem. It's obvious that it does, but instead of thinking, what's the etiology of borderline personality disorder, we need to think in what way does childhood trauma affect the developing adolescent mind. So I think for researchers, we need to move away from thinking about illnesses and try to understand the things that happen to us and how they affect us. For clinicians, we need to stop trying to treat illnesses and start engaging with people to offer them solutions to their problems that really work. And for the general public, I think, yes, we need to stop thinking in terms of illness and diseases and disorders and dysfunctions. Yes, I'll repeat it because it's worth repeating. I do think that my brain is a biological organ, but my brain is a biological organ that produces rubbish poetry and pretty good academic papers. It's also an organ that produces anxiety and depression and weird psychotic experiences from time to time. So we should think in terms of human phenomena for the general public, for policymakers, for clinicians and for researchers, yes.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm afraid that's all the time we've got, so thank you.